Welcome to day 2 of the 5th annual Mass Step Conference. I'm Dost Unger. I'm a psychiatrist at McLean Hospital and director of the LEAP Center, which is an NIMH-funded research center. And we collaborate closely with our Department of Mental Health and with MapNet, and we're delighted to co-host this conference. Today's, of course, the second day of our conference, and yesterday we had a wonderful in-person session. The conference this year we've called Systems and Communities of Care. Yesterday's day 1 was titled From Research to Practice, and today we're continuing with the Systems and Communities of Care theme. One reminder that I want to give all of you is to be aware of the continuing education units, CEUs, that are going to be available. And our team's going to be putting the links to access the CEUs process in the chat box. So stay tuned for and look in the chat box for the CEUs. So we have a great session today. In a couple of minutes, we're going to get started with a presentation from Carlos Larrauri. And then we have Dr. Rashawn Davis from an IMH. And then we have a break, a 20-minute break. When we come back, we're going to have a presentation from the Mass Step Lived Experience Committee. And then presentation from the Mass Step Financing Committee and some closing remarks from Dr. Macheri Keshavan. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and introduce Carlos Larrauri, our first presenter. So Carlos Larrauri, JD, MPA, APRN, is co-chair of the Accelerating Medicines Partnership Schizophrenia, or AMP-SCITS, which is a major NIH-funded international consortium for advancing research on early phases of schizophrenia and related psychotic disorders. Carlos has formerly served on the National Alliance on Mental Illness and NAMI Miami-Dade County Board of Directors. Diagnosed with schizophrenia at 23 years of age, access to quality mental health care, community-based treatment, and early intervention afforded him the best opportunity for recovery. Mr. Larrauri pursued a law degree at the University of Michigan Law School and the concurrent Master's in Public Administration at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he was Zuckerman Fellow at Harvard's Center for Public Leadership. He's also board certified as a family nurse practitioner and psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, and he has formerly lectured at the University of Miami and Miami-Dade College. Mr. Larrauri aspires to interface advocacy and research to reduce health inequities for people living with mental illness. We're delighted to have him on today's program, and he's going to be presenting about integrating lived experience to enhance clinical development in the AMP-SCITS program. Carlos, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ungar. And let me go ahead and thank Dr. Keshavan and his team and everyone who helped organize the Mass Step 2024 conference and for allowing me to share a little bit about my work, my story, and my advocacy. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Okay, let's go ahead and put this into presenter view. Okay, perfect. So I'm assuming everyone can hear me clearly and can see the slides.
Yes.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Ungar. As he mentioned, I'm a clinician by training, a nurse practitioner. I also have some legal and policy background. However, I am mostly going to share my perspective from that as someone with lived experience and how lived experience can enhance mental health research, including specifically clinical development, the development of treatments and medications for people at risk for psychosis. I'm going to go ahead and just say that I welcome questions. However, I'd like to leave 5 or 10 or so minutes for the end of the presentation to address those questions. But if something comes to mind, feel free to leave it in the chat, and I'll be happy to address it later. All righty. So today's session will have a 3-part structure. First, we'll discuss the impact of lived experience in mental health research, exploring the scientific and ethical basis for engaging people with lived experience. Second, we'll take a closer look at the Accelerating Medicines Partnership Program in Schizophrenia, which, as Dr. Unger mentioned, is a public-private partnership with over $100 million invested to develop and accelerate therapeutics for people at risk for psychosis. That brings together stakeholders from across the spectrum, public stakeholders like the federal government, NIMH, FDA, private stakeholders like pharmaceutical industry partners, and advocacy groups from civic society like NAMI and One Mind. And I'm going to talk about how lived experience has provided value to the initiative, how it helped catalyze it, how it continues to shape it moving forward. And then I am going to talk about some best practices that hopefully give you some takeaways for your work, whether you are in research, whether you are a service provider, whether you're a researcher or clinician, or whether you're someone with lived experience that's hoping to get involved in this space, sharing what I think is some of the evidence base, but also personal insights from my work doing this for a few years now. So first, let's discuss the sort of scientific or evidence base for incorporating people with lived experience. Patient-oriented research, it also goes by other names, community-based research, or community engagement or community involvement. Ultimately, all emphasize this idea that people with lived experience should be engaged because it can heighten the relevance, feasibility, adoption, implementation. Just trying to exit something. And sustainability. There is an evidence base that goes back over 40 years, particularly in the area of psychosis research, that establishes that incorporating people with lived experience can help with these various domains. It could help to target things that matter more to patients. It could help with operationalizing the finding of the science. It could help with disseminating the research, so forth. Integration of lived experience also addresses the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion by recognizing the value of insights with lived experience of mental health issues and may contribute to the cultural change within the research environment. So as we'll discuss, you can think about this in two parts. In one way, you can think about reaching out to the community and engaging people with lived experience with non-academic backgrounds. But you can also think about this as changing the cultural institution of science and research generation and promoting and providing a forum or voice for people that are researchers and have lived experience. So again, there's a group of people that are lived experience people without academic backgrounds, and there's people with academic backgrounds that are aspiring to be researchers that also have lived experience. And I'm sure that I'm not the only person on this Zoom that has a lived experience of a mental health issue. But there's still a cultural stigma associated with it, and people fear, justifiably, that their career aspirations could be dampened by sharing their identity as someone with lived experience or a psychiatric disability. Maybe they'll have trouble finding grants or publishing the high impact journals they hope to. But this integration could help contribute to that cultural change. And also, as you'll see in the AMP Schizophrenia initiative, there is a potential to support the ethical implementation of precision psychiatry in clinical care as we move towards tools that help with digital phenotyping using the smartphone or wearables to collect data. This is still sort of a wide open field, and the regulatory, ethical frameworks or parameters are not fully established, and there's an opportunity for people with lived experience to help guide and develop that framework. So let's discuss it from an ethical perspective. Incorporating people with lived experience, I think, aligns with the 4 pillars of medical ethics. That is, doing good, avoiding harm, promoting autonomy, and promoting justice. As a lawyer in training, I will particularly focus on the the justice element here, and this idea that it combats epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice is the idea that certain groups of people, for whatever reason, for because of their identities or their marginalized status, are denied opportunities to create knowledge and derive meaning from their experience. Research doesn't occur in a silo; it occurs in a power hierarchy, and certain groups have been excluded from the opportunity to contribute to that generation of scholarship. It also aligns with the motto from the disability advocacy community, which is that there should be nothing about us without us. Um, uh, as you know, there is unfortunately history in the psychiatric field and in mental health research of occasionally exploitation or using people without attributing their contributions. So this kind of turns it on its head and recognizes that if you're doing research on the community, you should be engaging the community to ensure that research is done with and not on people affected by mental health conditions. Again, it's ethically imperative to include the contributions of people who lived experience, to challenge knowledge hierarchies, and reduce the perpetuation of exclusion and powerlessness. So that provides a bit of an overview for what I think are some of the scientific justifications and ethical justifications for including people with lived experience. I will now turn towards the Accelerated Medicines Partnership Program, discussing that at a high level, and then discussing my involvement and how people with lived experience can engage in mental health research. So, right from the beginning, people with lived experience, particularly my dear friend and colleague Brandon Staglin, who is the founder of the One Mind organization, uh, helped lay the scientific foundation for this initiative by helping fund and catalyze the North American Prodrome longitudinal study, the NAPLE study. Back in 2003, One Mind and the National Institute of Mental Health convened 10 institutions across North America um, with the aspiration of developing tools to predict the onset of psychosis in the clinical high risk population. Those are young adults who have some attenuated symptoms of psychosis and are at risk for developing schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. Um, However, as you know, we often fail to capture people in those moments that they may be help seeking or still in that prodrome or early phase of the illness. And as you know, we often rely on a crisis oriented system of care where we capture people or help people when they're already into a full blown episode, and there's already potentially long term impacts that can affect their well being and their trajectories in life. So One Mind ran several longitudinal studies from 2003 to 2020 involving over 2,500 participants that looked at various markers, including clinical interviews, neurocognitive tests, EEG measures, structural MRI, stress markers, inflammatory markers, and genetic indices. Ultimately, in addition to developing a prediction tool from these assessments, this research formed the basis for the Accelerated Medicines Partnership Schizophrenia biomarker studies, which kind of took this approach and really expanded it. So how did we get to the Accelerated Medicines Partnership in schizophrenia? Again, people with lived experience, particularly facilitated through their affiliation with advocacy organizations like One Mind and like the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is the largest grassroots advocacy organization for individuals with mental health conditions and their families, helped convene the stakeholders, helped catalyze the initiative. Back in 2014, NAMI partnered with the Stanley Center, which I believe is at the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT, to lead the Advancing Discovery Summit to call for large-scale mental illness research that involved cross-collaboration between advocacy, academia, industry, and government. Now, this was a concerted effort that took persistence and resilience because The AMP program had existed in various disease spaces. Um, uh, and although there was an appetite for a psychiatric AMP, um, it didn't immediately get off the ground. You know, Nevertheless, NAMI persisted, convening stakeholders and industry leaders like Steve Heidman and Tom Insel, former directors of the NIMH. And after several years, it led to the successful launch of AMP Schizophrenia in 2020. Again, an example of continued advocacy, pushing for what the needs of the community are, which is new treatments that address, in particular, people at earlier stages of the illness and um, uh, neglected symptom domains like cognitive and negative symptoms, which, as we know, we have good medications or medications that are effective at treating positive symptom psychosis, but we still lack adequate treatments for the other symptom domains like cognitive and negative symptoms. I'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the Shear Family Foundation, who helped enable this project through the donations, and mentioning that NAMI continues to host the Advancing Discovery Summit to build on previous achievements and seek further breakthroughs in mental health research. So I've talked a lot about AMP, schizophrenia, and now I want to just dive deeper into what it is for people that are not familiar with this project. Again, AMP is a public-private partnership, over 100 some million odd dollars invested, bringing together stakeholders from across the spectrum: civic society, NAMI, One Mind, industry partners, and the federal government, NIMH, FDA. It's an international collaborative across 5 continents. And the overall goal of AMP is to provide tools to considerably improve success in developing pharmacological treatments for patients with clinical high risk for psychosis. Again, the clinical high risk population being a group of people with attenuated psychotic symptoms that are kind of undifferentiated. But as you can see from this diagram, some people in the high risk group will go on and develop, will convert to psychosis. That'll be one sort of bucket. Another group will become non-remitters and not convert. That means that they have some cognitive symptoms and some functional impairment, but don't have full-blown psychosis, but haven't fully remitted into the prior baseline of wellness. And then we have some people that will not convert and experience a return to their baseline of well-being. So AMP hopes to achieve this, developing treatments for this population by 2 aims. One, providing tools to enable the selection of enriched patient populations to improve the pharmacological treatment and developing pharmacological treatments for patients with clinical high risk for psychosis. And then the second aim, and that's primarily done through an observational study, which is over 2,000 people at high risk for psychosis and about 500 healthy controls. And the second aim, through a proof of principle study, we hope to develop and validate the biomarker and outcome measures that can establish early indicators of pharmacological treatment efficacy. So basically, from aim 1, from our observational study, we're going to do a gamut, and we have been doing a gamut of deep phenotyping, clinical interviews, neurocognitive assessments, neuroimaging, as you see here, EEG, fluid biomarkers, including blood and saliva, digital phenotyping, passive and active, including GPS, actigraphy, and speech and facial language sampling. And the goal is to develop, through this phenotyping, a risk stratification algorithm that can then stratify the clinical high risk population into those outcomes. And then we hope to, with that tool, which will be a multimodal data analytic approach, test that in a proof of principle study to see if it does, in fact, link with biomarkers or outcome measures. So the study, as I mentioned, is over 5 continents. It consists of, some of these will probably be your colleagues and you'll recognize these names: the ProNet, the Psychosis Risk Outcome Network, which includes Scott Woods, Carrie Bearden, and John Kane. The Predict Network is led by Martha Shenton and Renee Kahn, and our Prescient Network is led by our Australian colleagues, Barnaby Nelson and Patrick McGorry. This slide's a little outdated. We do have the sites fully active and recruiting at this point, I believe. Again, recruiting close to 2,500 subjects for the observational study. And as you can see, this is the gamut of assessments. I think the takeaway here is that the real focal point is week 0, where people will go through the full gamut of assessments, and then month 0, and then month 2 or visit 4, following up at 2 months, where they'll go through it again. And the hope is that we can detect a signal as early as within 2 months, which would also be consistent with the length of many clinical trials for the development of pharmaceutical interventions for this population. But we're still following up people for over 2 years with a variety of assessments, including digital data, actigraphy, and so forth, and at the point of conversion to psychosis. So hopefully that gives you an overview of the Accelerated Medicine's partnership schizophrenia program, how it works. If you're interested in learning more, you can, of course, visit ampscz.org. And now I'm going to pivot and share a little bit about the role of lived experience in it. So even at the highest levels, including the governance of the project, lived experience leadership has played a role. The steering committee is co-led by what are now 3 chairs, one representing each sector. Linda Brady representing the public sector at the FNIH, Gan Pandina representing the private sector as an industry partner, and myself representing civic society as NAMI's representative. But this kind of approach really ensures that all stakeholders, which each play a unique role in this ecosystem, are represented, and ensures that the inclusion of lived experience voices that understand the challenges and aspirations of those with schizophrenia is heard. As a funny aside, this was an elected position. I was up against some very qualified people. I had yet to earn my credentials, so I didn't have as many letters behind my name yet. I certainly didn't think I was going to be elected, but someone threw my hat in the ring, and I was elected, which goes to the point that democracies and democratic voting can be a bit of a surprise at times. Uh, uh, but it's been one of the privileges of my professional career, and it speaks to the appetite that there is from industry and from other partners for people with lived experience engaging in mental health research. So I've played a role in contributing to the development of the research plan, offering expertise and ensuring participant considerations are prioritized. For example, there was considerable concern over patient burden at the month 0 and month 2 visit. Is this going to be too much of an assessment that'll weigh on people? Uh, Additionally, there really is a culture within the AMP schizophrenia effort that is committed to transparency and ensuring that voices of lived experience is heard. That is, my participation is welcomed at all facets of the organization, not just in the governance and the steering committee level, but in the working groups, in any of the technical team meetings, and so forth, at the operational level of the project as well. And although this, I think, sends a symbolic gesture, having someone in leadership that represents lived experience, as you will see, I think it also leads to concrete and practical benefits within the effort. So the first thing, of course, was early on, the research design, the patient burden, and the use of data. This is kind of at the very preliminary phases of the project. So I've played a role in helping review the study protocols and the ongoing conduct of the study. We provided Brandon and myself insights into the biomarker assessments and the perceived burden from the perspective of study participants. And we've ensured an attempt to ensure the ethical use of sensitive data and support the establishment of data sharing processes for participants. So again, that's pretty high level, but I'll go into it more concretely with some examples in the next coming slides. So here's an example of the data sharing and the use of patients with lived experience to, I think, create a sort of a learning system for the research project that ultimately leads to better research and more ethically conducted science. Uh, so excuse me while I read the quote, but this is from John Torres, who I'm sure is a colleague to many of you, who has expertise in digital phenotyping and has developed a digital assessment platform used in the AMP schizophrenia studies called MindLamp. MindLamp has been built over the last 5 years with direct co-design and over 200 updates. So its design reflects the input of many stakeholders with lived experience. This involvement, coupled with actively sharing research data from the app back to the users, has helped to build trust and contributed to the app's robust uptake by more than 80% of study participants. This surprisingly strong engagement is now yielding useful data to support the AMP's aim to lay the groundwork for developing original medicines to treat people in the earliest stages of schizophrenia. Now, this was quite a pleasant surprise compared to our priors. You know, we thought that people with psychosis, in particular, people who experience paranoia, would be resistant to sharing this information or would be hesitant to engage in some of the digital phenotyping assessments. But quite to the contrary, we've had a robust uptake. And this is one of the areas where this project in particular is leading the way. And as an example of incorporating the patients in the design, in the implementation, operationalization of this tool, and continuing to engage with them by sharing the assessments and the data. So another example um, arises from my efforts with the AMP Schizophrenia Hackathon, which was a 2-day event where we brought together the technical team leads. These are groups that are working on the various assessments like the EEG, the speech sampling, the biospecimens and so forth. And, you know, we sat together in a room and tried to just do some interactive sessions where we, you know, worked together. And I think by providing my qualitative experience, by providing my insights, it really informed some of the I think it not only provided a richer and more comprehensive understanding of psychosis for the researchers, in addition to their empirical understanding and insights, but I think it possibly will have informed the research trajectory of this enterprise. So I wrote an article entitled Messiah or Pariah, Psychosis, Science, and Finding Meaning in Lived Experience. One of the ways in which I've come to reflect on my experience with psychosis through science. So I would often I would often focus my gaze on an unusual spot or avoid eye contact with others due to the social anxiety or cognitive impairments associated with the disease. My eyes would fixate on the ceiling as if I were a figure in a Renaissance painting, a martyr or saint looking upward, awaiting the arrival of kingdom come. This frequent, intense upward stare prompted those around me to ask, "What's up there, Carlos? What's going on?" This behavior distanced me from normal social exchanges, leaving my friends and family feeling awkward and confused by my attachment. Now, first, I'd be remiss if I didn't know that this was a Counter-Reformation painting, because my mom is a bit of an art person. So this is more precisely a Counter-Reformation painting. But more pertinently, what was happening for me at this time was I was kind of running up to the limits of my rationality. I was having these experiences that I attributed to the supernatural because I didn't understand them through what I believe now is the vernacular of science, you know. So when I had these issues of anxiety or cognitive impairment, you know, when I found it difficult to make eye contact with people, or to act within the normal bounds of socially appropriate behavior, I would stare away in a way that was sort of outside the bounds of what's considered normal. And I think people that treat this population see this in the clinical care. They notice people looking at their hands for a long time, or they notice them staring up at the ceiling, and you can see this with other illnesses, maybe with depression, with autism, but there's something there. Um, this should say probably facial expression instead of speech sampling, but with discussion to the research with in conversation of the researchers, some of their insights were, well, perhaps not only does gaze play a role and we can measure and observe the gaze, perhaps we can also look at the trajectory of like the panel that the face is on, as far as determining whether the behavior is outside the bounds of normal. For me, I would often be, looking up, eyes fixated at the ceiling, kind of like this figure in the Renaissance painting, up, the panel or the plane of my face away from what's considered maybe more normal and appropriate conversational norms, like looking at someone directly with eye contact or facing them. And it was to the point that people again commented on it. This was clearly just not, people felt compelled to say that what's going on, what's happening up there. And it left people again feeling awkward and confused. So that's an example of, we're sharing my qualitative experience, that is now informed by my scientific and clinical understanding of the illness with researchers, can inform their inquiry into what to look for, what to assess, what to measure with their assessments. Not only, and I think this has been true for other facets of the project, not just with facial expression, but also with speech sampling, some of the acoustic properties, not just what is said, but how it is said. Um, Sharing some of my insights, I think have been helpful there as well. So, one way that I think people plug in and play pretty neatly with lived experience in research is helping with dissemination of findings and helping with, if you will, the marketing of the project. People have to learn about this effort, and science, scientific studies and data and numbers communicate something, but so does storytelling. So a lot of my work has been assisting with the outreach, including the development of our website, which we founded the WOW group, the website and outreach working group, to oversee outreach to the AMP schizophrenia population, focusing on both researchers and the community. This is led by folks, Tina and Eve, at Brigham and Women's Hospital, McLean Hospital, NAMI, NIMH, and FNIH, Tina Kapoor and Eve Lewandowski. And our goal is to maintain the AMP Schizophrenia's online presence and help with dissemination. Again, not just to the professionals, but also to the people at risk and their families. And we have a working paper, which, without giving away too much of it, will hopefully demonstrate that it has led to a significant, increase in referral traffic from websites such as NAMI, suggesting engagement with those experiencing this illness and their families. So I think this has been a particularly productive aspect of the partnership as well. And it's a way that also people that may not speak both vernaculars, that may not have the lived experience insight, and also speak the science or the clinical or have an appreciation for the technical aspects of researcher, but for the non-academics, people that can plug in and play pretty neatly, can help with ensuring that this is culturally appropriate, where this is at an appropriate level of health literacy, that speaks to them. Even simple things like, we originally wanted the first picture on the website to be the kind of stereotypical image of someone downtrodden, looking in the window, introspective, looking depressed. But I advocated for having someone quite to the contrary, a young adult with a backpack moving forward, conveying hope and optimism, understanding that the population we're serving, even if we think of schizophrenia, we unfortunately associate with prejudices such as homelessness or violence or antisocial behaviors. The reality is that, at least at first blush, the people that are highest risk and first encountering this are individuals that are young students and young adults, people in high school and college and in their first jobs. So I wanted to convey that sentiment as opposed to what may be more stereotypical presentations of the illness. And we have been busy with getting the word out. This is just a few of our publications and presentations, um, including in a variety of uh, avenues. We've had outreach to the NAMI community through NAMI Advocate. We've done podcasts. We've done Psychiatric Times. We've done peer-reviewed journals like Psychiatric Services, Schizophrenia Bulletin, World Psychiatry, and so forth. So there really has been a concerted effort to get the word out, and as such, the project has been moving forward in a pace consistent with expectations. I think in small part because of this effort to continue to educate the community about our work and so forth. So I want to turn to some takeaways for all of you, and I want to leave 10 minutes or so for questions and answers. I haven't checked the chat, but if anyone has any, I want to welcome those. But I want to turn to takeaways from my involvement with AMP Schizophrenia, as well as insight into best practices. And part of this is derived from, again, working with Brandon Staglin at One Mind and my affiliation with the Healthy Brains Global Initiative, HBGI, which is an organization that hopes to transform global mental health. And some of the work we've done in the Lived Experience Council on how to embed lived experience into organizations and service delivery. Um, and I want to be fair, so I'll address, I think, what are some of the limitations that I've also been involved in my participation with AMP Schizophrenia and what I've seen as some of the challenges as well. So we've discussed why embedding lived experience, that improves research quality and accessibility, that it helps point researchers towards what matters to patients, more tangible outcomes for the intended population, and in the particular case of psychosis, trying to find those holy grail treatments for issues like cognitive or negative symptoms. But it also plays, I think, a role for the people involved. In my article, Messiah or Pariah, Psychosis, Science, and Finding Meaning in Lived Experience, I talk about how the participation in this research project helps my own recovery. It helps me develop meaning and find purpose in my suffering so that it wasn't all in vain. By being able to contribute to the knowledge of this field, by being able to help develop more effective solutions, I transform my adversity into, I think, a triumph, and hopefully give back to others in a way that's very, that's adaptive and helpful. So just like peer support can help the people that receive the support, it also helps the people delivering the support. Just like engaging people, I think it's the same for people with lived experience engaging in research. Not only does it help make the research better, but it helps the people with lived experience engaging in it as well. And I think it can lead to decreased stigma and enhanced trust. I think this is particularly crucial in a time where there has been increasing skepticism towards science and institutions. But by engaging with the community, hopefully we can build that trust and establish and help legitimize this enterprises. Ultimately, communicating that the patient is at the center of this whole ecosystem. Um, and again, changing the culture of science so that scientists and researchers with seniority or those that are up and coming appreciate that people with lived experience or with disabilities or otherwise can contribute meaningfully to the field with academic backgrounds or otherwise. So this will take 3 parts. I'll talk about culture and why it's important to provide a welcoming environment amongst diverse stakeholders. I'll talk about systems to ensure that lived experience can be reliably and sustainably ingrained. And I'll talk about resources to ensure the team has the right supports to help people participate fairly and equitably. So culture, I think, really starts at the top and trickles down. I think getting leadership that buys into this idea um, is the most fruitful way to start. I think um, I've been very fortunate to be with organizations like NAMI, with Healthy Brains Global Initiative, with AMP Schizophrenia, that really have their leadership have bought into this idea that we need to put patients at the center of this and try to move towards patient-focused drug development and try to move towards an approach that treats the patient and person with lived experience as a co-equal in this enterprise, really. Um, so of course, diversity embraces various facets, not just lived experience or disabilities, but it can be race, ethnicity, gender, and so forth. But it's important to create a psychologically safe environment where people feel that they can express their lived experience and it feels valued and contributes to the generation of knowledge. This can be hard because sometimes there is an asymmetry of knowledge and information. Sometimes I felt like a fly on the wall and just wanted to let the experts speak. But I've, very, but I feel very safe and encouraged by the colleagues I work with to contribute, and in the process learn how to do so more efficiently and better. But again, it can be a challenge for people that haven't had this experience, or people that have just recently had their lived experience. Perhaps it can trigger them. Perhaps they haven't learned how to communicate in a way that's helpful yet. So it's important to create a psychologically safe space, and that may be providing breaks or having ethical parameters for how people can contribute. Um, this can be facilitated by co-designing the role with people with lived experience. And it's important to see the strength beyond the lived experience. That is, people also bring in a host of other expertises and professional experience. In my case, it could be clinical or legal. In other cases, it could be in marketing, communications, and so forth. But focusing on only the illness, I think, is not the right way either. We want to kind of treat this holistically. It's just one facet that informs people's contributions. So, as scientists, as clinicians, and so forth, you often think about systems and structures. And I think it's important to think about it this way also. I can tell you what you don't want to do, which is think of this in an ad hoc fashion and think we just need someone with lived experience to check a box here. You want to think about a way to systematize this, and whether that is through in developing advisory boards, um, engaging with key informants or thought leaders, or focus groups. There's various methodologies that have each have their pros and cons for how to get community feedback. Um, but again, the important thing is that it's not just an afterthought. And to be fair, this is one of the limitations of AMP schizophrenia. Involvement from NAMI and myself and Brandon in One Mind, we're a small sample for intents and purposes. We're a sample of two. And especially with a disease of like schizophrenia or psychosis, which has a great degree of heterogeneity, if you're truly trying to be more representative of the population you serve, we probably want a greater sample of people providing input, whether that's through young adults, whether that's through more diverse racial and ethnic composition. But I think ultimately that's one of our limitations, and hopefully something we'll address in a reiteration in AMP Schizophrenia 2.0. But we're still making progress. We're still going in the right direction. Um, and yes, thinking about how to assess and measure this, including reports, to ensure that leadership is accountable to lived experience members is another way of systematizing it. This is done in HBGI, for example, where we have a lived experience council that reports to the governing structure of the organization, and so forth. I still want to leave time for some questions, so we're approaching towards the end. So lastly, resources. The takeaway here is that you have to treat people as co-equals in this enterprise. And, people like myself and Brandon are able to engage in a volunteer capacity because of our privileges, because of our affiliation with nonprofits, and perhaps we see that as part of our service-oriented activities. But there is a recognition that people with lived experience are experts by experience, and some people call it that. And there are tools and resources to help consider how to um, uh, treat people fairly from an economic perspective with their contributions. For example, that I think it's the National Patient Council has a calculator for calculating fair market value for patient input, and this is particularly salient for industry partners, but it could also be true for academics. So I think contributing, compensating people fairly is an important step in the right direction. Um, and of course, allowing people to opt in to what they consider appropriate when sharing. This goes to, I think, developing ethical frameworks for how to contribute lived experience, because as was said earlier, it could still rehash challenging feelings and sentiments for people that have uh, um, recently experienced it. One kind of other resource I want to point out to two, that I think are best practices that are developing. The Welcome Trust is, now requires that people applying for grants have a strategy, a plan for that addresses this issue, this approach in a systemized way for their grants, which I think is good. I think, it's great. I think offering a carrot is the right way to go as opposed to, a stick and regulating or mandating that people do this, but offering, grant funding contingent on having a communicating and developing a strategy for incorporating the community and patient with lived experience is the right way to go. And the other, I think, is my colleague Charlene Sunkel at the Global Mental Health Peer Network is also working with Welcome to hopefully develop a training module. So people can develop the skill of how to engage with mental health research, um, as it is something like any other thing that can be practiced and can be developed. Recognizing that there are researchers that need to learn how to work with people lived experience. There are non-academic peers that want to contribute to research, and there are also academic peers, peer researchers that have lived experience that want to have careers as researchers, but also want to incorporate their lived experience, for example, like myself, into their research and advocacy. So those are some resources to consider in the pipeline and ways to think about this factor. So I do want to leave 10 minutes or so for questions and answers, or uh, or just or allow anyone to have a space for a break or whatever they may need. But I just want to convey my gratitude to the community of scientists and clinicians. Your efforts bring hope and inspiration for those affected like myself. I can take reassurance in knowing that some of our best and brightest are working on this really challenging problem, um, how to develop better treatments for this population. Likewise, I think hearing from people who've experience hopefully fills your cup and hopefully reminds you of why your work matters, especially for some that might be in the bench or for some that might be working for an industry but aren't directly working with patients. Maybe they're in some other aspect of the business. Communicating my story hopefully reminds people that they serve a bigger mission. And for the community, peers and families, um, I want to convey my optimism and my gratitude to them as well, and recognize that hopefully this future where co-participation and co-creation becomes the norm with mental health research. I think it's especially important for mental health because of the history of injustices, and also because mental health is uniquely situated with respect to other medical fields. Part of recovery isn't just taking a medication or a passive activity. To really recover with illness, you have to engage in it, and you have to be active in your own recovery. And for me, part of that has been giving back, has been service through NAMI, has been helping to contribute to the knowledge in this field and to help bring solutions to other people. So I think that's an important facet of a recovery in mental health that's a little different than other illnesses. Um, Lastly, kind of to open it up to a broader discussion, I want to just share a brief anecdote. Um, so perhaps you have someone who is a neuroscientist who is born blind, and perhaps as a neuroscientist, they they understand the function of the rods and the cones and how they give rise to color vision or black and white vision. Perhaps they understand the significance of the color, perhaps the color of red, and how it has in literary circles can mean, or in art can mean passion or danger or so forth. But if this person who was born blind, but albeit is a neuroscientist who studies vision and specializes in color, can this person really know what the color red is if they've never directly experienced it? Is there an analog for psychosis? You know, Perhaps you understand the dopamine hypothesis, perhaps you understand the buckets of the different symptoms, but if you haven't had direct experience of delusions or paranoia, can you fully appreciate, the condition? And, the brilliant scientist Albert Einstein said, the only source of knowledge is ultimately through experience. And all this is to say is that I think it's in tandem with the scientists, with the empiricists, with those methods, along with the qualitative approach with the lived experience, that together we develop a richer and fuller picture of psychosis and this illness and can develop more effective solutions. So again, thank you for your time. I welcome any questions. And yes, I will
Thank you.
stop. Yep, sorry.
Thank you so much, Carlos. It's for such a wonderful talk. There is so much wisdom. It felt like every minute had pearls in it. So thank you. We do have a few minutes for discussion and questions. I see one hand raised and one comment in the chat. Let's start with maybe the question in the chat. It's from Megan Good, and it says, in medicine, we talk about disease-modifying drugs, which are medications that change illness prognosis in addition to symptom management. Lithium is a good example. As someone with both clinical and personal experience, what outcomes would disease-modifying treatments for schizophrenia prioritize?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'll take a step back and answer it from a broader perspective. When you ask people with lived experience what matters, functioning is key. That is what we often care about. I mean, and if you want to get really kind of into it, people would say ultimately what matters to patients is what matters to each individual person. I put a preference on work and school because that's what matters to me, and I think that's what matters to a lot of people as far as functional outcomes. But perhaps for another patient, it could be engaging in hobbies or going out and dating. So the challenge is as clinicians wearing that hat also, that's not often what's measured. That's not what's measured by the PANS, the positive assessment, a positive negative symptom scale. That's not what measured in clinical trials. So how do you align those two is a good question. There are some approaches where people are taking more experimental approaches to secondary endpoints, still using conventional primary endpoints like rating scales, but also considering perhaps patient-reported outcomes or otherwise. Ultimately, I think that the link between what matters to patients is modified by the symptoms, but it's not always the case. In some cases, people still have symptoms and are still able to achieve their goals or their outcomes. In other cases, people may have less symptoms but are unable to achieve their goals or outcomes. So it's a really good question. Considering that this affects, again, young adults and youth, and it's such a formative stage of identity and development, I think if you ask most of them, and if you asked me early in my phase of my illness, what would matter for me as far as it would have been, and it was going back to school, working, dating, the things that, as Freud said, love and work is what is a cornerstone of our humanity and what all of us want. And how could you not quote Freud when you're talking about psychiatry? All right.
Great. Vera, go ahead.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, for sure. So something that I noticed in the presentation was that demographic diversity of the people being reached by the interventions presented was not really emphasized. Locally, we noticed in our research projects, particularly ones with many lengthy data collection visits, tend to do worse in terms of demographic representation of people with intersecting marginalized identities, particularly low-income people of color, which are more likely to be lost to attrition over time. I bring this up because of the research industry's current focus on biomarker monitoring with an orientation towards biomedical and biotechnological solutions to issues in service utilization and early detection, not social determinants which primarily drive healthcare inequities, particularly housing access, wage inequity, state reliance on oppressive carceral structures, and widening class divides. So my question is, what would be your recommendations to make sure that the goals of studies and the application of results actually benefit all people we serve and not just those with economic privilege to access expensive screening tools? Because I think this ties back to community-based participatory research, because I've seen that sort of used rhetorically in a lot of ways to just let's create some sort of advisory council without actually giving people leadership roles. I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah. Ooh, Vera, you're asking the hard-hitting questions. You're not letting me off easy. There's a lot to unpack there. I think, taking a step back again and answering this broadly, when I think of, first episode psychosis and schizophrenia, I do view it through a biomedical lens primarily in the fact that it is a crisis. Just like if I was having a heart attack and I wanted to go to my priority would be to go to the emergency room, get my heart pumping blood again, put me on, whatever would be needed, blood thinners or so forth. And then you can talk to me about DASH, a healthy lifestyle, a diet. If someone's in the first episode of psychosis, perhaps peer and psychosocial interventions are critical But more importantly, I think is stabilizing what I think is a kind of also a biomedical crisis. And then you can add, and then you can address kind of those social determinants of health down the road. I think addressing it from that perspective recognizes that it is a medical crisis and it's necessary, but it also, with humility recognizes that it's insufficient. Medicine in that sense has been a necessary component of my recovery. If I took it away, everything would fall apart, but it hasn't been sufficient also. I've been able to recover because I had my basic needs met with support from family, because I found meaningful work and school where I could, bring my lived experience to bear and could also give back to my community. So that's kind of my feelings and my perspective on it. As far as the broader issue of how to address this, the tough one. I think we need to do more work. I recognize the limitations in NAMI schizophrenia. Like I said, having an N of two of two key thought leaders is not sufficient to address the heterogeneity of this community. I think we have to continue to think about it in a systemized way. How do we get these underrepresented voices? Often the people that can contribute are people of privilege like myself that have the means to volunteer or have the education that allows me to speak across both languages. But I think we have to continue to do outreach and we can engage. We have to engage. It's not enough that we just build it and they will come. We have to meet people where they're at. So, some exciting work, a little outside the research enterprise. But for example, I have a colleague who meets Black men in barbershops and talks about mental health there. Perhaps they can meet Black men in barbershops and talk about mental health and talk about participation in clinical trials or talk about participation in mental health research. I don't know if they do that, but maybe that's an idea. But the idea that, we can just build it and they will come, I think is not the right approach. I think you have to actively engage with outreach and you have to meet people where they're at. So that's kind of one idea that I'm just tossing up, but yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I think that's something that I have been noticing a lot, like across the industry, is that like there is I think a resistance to put people with lived experience in the driver's seat, and very often, like us, for example, like we have a lot of intersections of privilege that allow us to be in these rooms, and there's plenty of people who don't have those same opportunities.
Yep. You're right.
Great. Well, thank you very much again, Carlos, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you again. Thank you for the opportunity.